Okay. More than ever before in human history, we share a common destiny. We can master it only if we face it together. And that, my friends, is why we have the United Nations. As quoted by Kofi Annan, the ex-president of the United Nations. So, the UN, the United Nations. Who are they? What do they do? What do you know? What have you heard about the United Nations? I'm hoping today I can provide you a little insight. Now, how am I going to do that? I'm going to talk about their charter, how they were established, what can make you a part of the United Nations, and what can disqualify you from being a part of the United Nations. We'll talk about the operations they've been involved in through the last 60 years. We'll also finish with the successes and the failures, and I'll let you formulate your own opinion. So, charter. How does one get into the United Nations? Well, it says in their preamble, you have to be a peace-loving country. It says that you have to want to provide humanitarian support. This is starting to sound like the answers given at a Miss USA pageant. How do you provide humanitarian support? Well, you have to have good international relations, and you have to have an international peacekeeping force. Who can join the United Nations? Anyone that's willing to hold up that charter. All 19 chapters of that charter. I'm not going to name all 19 chapters. You also, like I said earlier, have to be a peace-loving country. There are currently 192 countries that are a member of the United Nations. What gets you disqualified? Charter violations. If you violate any one of the policies in those 19 chapters, you are removed from the United Nations. What's one of the largest violations that can be performed? Violations against humanity. Unsanctioned wars, genocide, those kind of things are things that have removed countries from the UN. So, you know how they're formed. Let me tell you some of the things that they've done. The United Nations was formed on 24 October 1945. When they formed, think about what was going on right then. So they had to establish a place to go. They immediately went to the east coast of the United States. Why? South America, Central America was irrelevant, was not relevant at that time. Of course, Europe is highly involved in a war, World War II. Russia, yeah, they're no good. Japan, China, Asia, also involved in World War II. So they said, cool, we're going to set up camp in the U.S. What did they immediately start with? They started with the rebuilding process of Germany, Japan, Russia, after all the turmoil that had happened in World War II. They were also highly involved in the late 40s, early 50s in what was the Yemeni Civil War. You ever been to Yemen? It's a good place for civil war. They were involved then in the late 50s all the way to the present day in peace treaties and peace talks with Syria and Israel. Continues today, and they're still highly embedded with those. We'll fast forward a little bit to 1990. They got extremely involved when Iraq invaded Kuwait. And when that didn't work, that's when the U.S. stepped in and said, we'll handle this. They were highly involved in Bosnia and Croatia with the genocide that had happened in that country. A little country in Africa called Somalia. And it was actually two operations, Somalia 1 and Somalia 2, because it's spanned so many years. And then most recently, Libya. With the overthrow of Gaddafi, the UN quickly stepped in. They're pretty busy. So let's evaluate successes and failures. Success. They have been part of 172 different peacekeeping treaties. They have provided the means of safe drinking water to 1.3 billion people. I think we roughly have 7.2 billion in the world. According to the World Health Organization, they are the main reason, and when I say they, I'm talking the UN, is the main reason for the eradication of the smallpox virus. Some pretty good successes. Ted Galen Carpenter, a USA Today reporter, wrote an article called 50 Years of Failure. And in it, he cited that the UN's performance has ranged from irrelevant to uninspiring. Some of why he wrote that is due to the failures that I'll tell you about. The UN has always been soft on terrorism. Up until 9/11, they didn't view terrorism as bad enough to get involved. After the attacks on 9/11 on New York City, and the UN is based in New York City, they found it to be more relevant. However, they did draw back after we adopted our policies on what we call the global war on terrorism. They don't agree with all the little battles the U.S. wants to fight. They are extremely weak on nuclear proliferation. They try to stay out of the nuclear realm, nuclear talks, or anything that has anything to do with countries developing nuclear weapons. Most recently, we've seen that with Iran. Probably the most highlighted failure of the United Nations was the genocides that occurred in Rwanda, in which they sent a UN peacekeeping force to restabilize the government, and even while the UN was there, 1 million civilians were killed through genocide. So, giving you a lot of information here. We talked about charters. We talked about who can join, how you get kicked out. We've talked about some of the operations that have covered a scope of 60 years. And we discussed some of the successes and some of the failures of the UN. So I'll just leave you with, based on the information you've received today, would you consider the United Nations a success or failure?